Now, Jesus College is an ancient institution. It's weathered many changes, maybe many existential threats. We were originally a 12th century nunnery, but became a college, part of the University of Cambridge, in 1496. We've been through civil and world wars, pandemics of the past. We've seen technologies change in many, many ways over that time. Our alumni have developed thoughts and ideas that have had a huge influence around the world. Whether we're talking about Thomas Malthus and his work on population, or Belinda Wilkes, who works with NASA running one of their deep space observatories. The Intellectual Forum is more recent. We were set up about 5 years ago to get people to think and talk about important issues and to reach outside the boundaries of our own college walls. We've had many stellar speakers in that time. We've had the fashion designer, Jimmy Choo. We've had 2 former Australian Prime Ministers, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, although not at the same time. And we've had the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization, Peter Simpson, talking about vaccine equity around the world. We've also shown off some of the transformational work still being done by our own academics, whether it's using synthetic biology to come up with a new, clean, safe way to dye clothes, to how we can fix a financial system to save us from climate change and other existential risks. And if you do want a treat, have a look at the Jesus College YouTube channel, where many of these talks and more are captured. And this one will be available there later as well. Today, we're particularly delighted to be working with the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. They are a truly talented group of people I've enjoyed working with for many years. And they're thinking really deeply about many of the issues that could challenge us as a species. And I hugely recommend their work, whether it's their work on AI, about climate, about biorisk, about nuclear conflict, on so much more. It's really well worth looking at, and it's a huge pleasure to be cooperating with them on this event. And tonight's speaker is one of a relatively rare breed, and I'm delighted that he's joined us very early in the morning from Australia for this. He's a politician and an academic. Andrew Leigh was a professor of economics at the Australian National University, and then in 2010 was elected as a federal member of Parliament in the House of Representatives, representing part of Canberra, the seat now known as Fenner. A member of the Labour Party, he's held government office as parliamentary secretary to the then Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who I mentioned earlier, and is now a shadow assistant minister for Treasury and for Charities. Although with elections coming up in a few months, who knows, maybe there's a return to government coming up. Now, today we're going to talk about his recent book, the optimistically titled, What's the Worst That Could Happen, which is available from all good bookstores near you and looks very much like this. So we're going to start off by having a chat, and then we're going to take questions from you in the audience. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to put in any questions, and I'll make sure to feed them in. So Andrew, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a real pleasure, Julian. Thank you for having me, and thanks also to Jesus College and the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. It's a treat to be chatting with you.
Well, thanks, and I hope we can welcome you in person at some point, but obviously it's a bit tricky and, environmental issues challenge that. Now, just to start off, it's just possible some of the people listening to this haven't yet read the book, which is obviously a great shame. Could you give us a summary of the book, maybe a sort of 5-minute, what's the main message? What is the worst that could happen?
Well, thanks, Julian. And I should also have acknowledged that I'm meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. What's the worst that could happen? Looks at some improbable but truly awful things that could not just decrease human welfare, but end the entire human project. And you could think of this a bit in the way in which you might think about taking out an insurance policy. Chances are this year your house will not burn down. The chances of that happening are less than 1%. But most of us take out house insurance because it would be catastrophic if that happened. And so too, as a species, I argue we ought to take out a little bit more insurance against some really calamitous things that might hit us. Classically, we think about an asteroid strike, whether you're looking at Deep Impact or Armageddon, or indeed Don't Look Up, the new movie on Netflix. They've featured the notion that the world might end by being struck by an asteroid. But it turns out that, not unrelated to the movies that I mentioned, there is now a NASA Planetary Defense Office which tracks near-Earth objects, and we've tangibly lowered the probability that an asteroid would strike the Earth and do to us what happened to the dinosaurs and enabled the rise of our species. So really the main catastrophic risks that I'm concerned about are nuclear war, pandemics, both naturally occurring, but particularly bioterrorism, unchecked climate change, which leads to not just 4 degrees, but 6 or 10 degrees of warming, and artificial intelligence gone awry. And then there's a series of other risks which are tangible, but not of that magnitude. And I argue, and what's the worst that could happen, that for modest investment, we can actually do a lot to reduce the risks of those things transpiring. Climate change has received considerable attention, and it turns out now that installing zero-cost energy sources not only reduces carbon emissions, but also brings down the marginal cost of energy. Nuclear war is potential if it's created intentionally, but also accidentally. And so with 10,000 weapons, many of them, or tens of thousands of weapons, many of them on hair trigger alert, we could do a lot to reduce the chances that a nuclear war happens by accident. I talk in the book about the system that the US military put in place at one point, so-called permissive action locks. But the military were worried that might impair their ability to fire the missiles speedily. And so all the lock codes were set to 00000000, a bit like a forgetful business person's briefcase. I talk too in the book about the challenge that artificial intelligence poses. This is one which is featured more in science fiction than in sensible policy conversations, but it's the largest risk in the book, in part because it is almost certain that at some point in the next couple of 100 years, we'll build a computer whose capacities exceed our own. And at that point, the question will be, are its interests aligned with ours? I argue that it's probably going to be fairly hard to figure out all of the scenarios in advance in which the intentions of the superintelligence would diverge from ours. And so probably what we want instead is a superintelligence which is coded to be observant, humble, and altruistic. And that those 3 principles are a clever way of ensuring that the machine learns steadily our values and doesn't do what Nick Bostrom once suggested of deciding that it wants to create as many paperclips as possible and use our homes and cars as raw material for that process. Overlying the entire book is the notion of populism, which has roiled the world. You've seen tastes of it in the UK, as indeed we have here in Australia. But places like Hungary and the United States and Brazil have been hit harder by the populist wave. Populists, almost by design, are a risk factor for these catastrophic threats. That's because they tend to turn the temperature up, denigrate experts, and deride international cooperation, undermining the very things we need in order to reduce the probability of catastrophic risks. There is, of course, a possibility a catastrophic possibility that comes from populists themselves, and that's in terms of a long-term totalitarian term. Think of it as 1984, but run with today's technologies. But the more pressing concern, I believe, is the risk that populism will exacerbate catastrophic threats. And it's that which animated me to write the book, and I guess distinguishes what's the worst that can happen from other works which have been written in the catastrophic risk vein, most particularly Toby Ord's terrific book, The Precipice. But with that, Julian, let me stop the overview remarks and look forward very much to your questions and those of your audience.
Well, thank you. And there's so much in there already that we could pick up on, and I can see some questions coming in. And please do start putting questions in now. We won't get to them quite yet. Now, you cover a lot of different risks, and there's a fascinating table, I think it's page 91, where you talk about the assessed risks of various different things. I'm not going to quiz you on the exact numbers, but you talk about the idea that the chance of a stellar explosion is about the same as the chance of being struck by lightning this week, and various other comparisons. Widespread authoritarianism that you were just talking about there, I think you say chances about 1 in 100 of that in the next 100 years, which is apparently the chance that your spouse cheated on you last month. Again, I'm not going to check you on the figures for that. Do people really understand how to think about these rare risks? Are we as a species very good at evaluating rare things?
Excellent point, and naturally the answer is no. We tend to be much more focused on things which are probable than things which are improbable but catastrophic. That makes sense in general as a survival tactic, and it's a reflection of the way in which many of us think about the world. It's also, I've got to say, why for most of my 11-year career as a politician, I haven't been focused on catastrophic risks. I've been focused, if you like, on the middle of the probability distribution, on making a difference on issues around energy policy, employment policy, education policy, systems that are already in place and which can be tangibly tweaked. And I still think that most of society's energy should go in that direction. But then sitting off in the tail of the distribution are these really catastrophic outcomes. And it doesn't cost very much to tangibly reduce those risks. Bioterrorism, for example, could well occur through a leak from a lab. And there's probably too many of these high safety BSL-4 labs in existence right now. It's worth remembering that the last person to die of smallpox in the world caught it through a lab leak. And so we need to be very careful in how we manage labs and ensure that the emerging technologies around genetic engineering continue to be used for good, to extend people's lives and quality of life, rather than fall into the hands of those who misuse them.
So there's just a really interesting comment that you've made, that you think this is important, but only for a small fraction of all of our efforts. And I think that's actually quite interesting in both ways. I've certainly heard it said before that being able to think about existential threats is a luxury for those of us who don't have other things to worry about. But you're not saying we should care about this rather than everything else, but just that we should do a little bit on all of these issues. Is that right?
Perfectly put. You wouldn't want to spend your entire income on your home fire insurance policy, but probably also spending 0% of your income on buying fire insurance is a bad idea as well.
So there was a lovely comment, I think it was Alita Sundaran who first pointed this out to me, was that the Bioweapons Convention, that the total number of staff, the expense on that is rather less than the average McDonald's franchise. And so maybe we could afford even 2 McDonald's franchises worth of checking that we don't destroy ourselves with bioweapons. But just to come back, because you said that you've had an 11-year elected office career, you were politically involved, I think, long before that. What changed your mind to thinking about these things? Was it COVID? Was it the idea that there was this large-scale threat suddenly?
It was a series of conversations. Robert Wiblin of 80,000 Hours was influential on me. Reading Toby Ord's book made an impact. Conversations with the economist John Quiggin in Australia. There were initial notions that we'd collaborate on a big project together, but after many of those discussions, decided that we didn't have the same views on all of these issues, and so I struck out alone and did so during the pandemic, a time when I think one form of catastrophic risk, at least, was much more in people's minds. Suddenly, people were reading Camus and discussing what it was like during the Black Death, and people were more aware of catastrophic risk. I suppose also the issue of people's health came to mind, but at the same time there were institutions that were grossly underfunded. You mentioned that great example of the Biological Weapons Convention. Another outfit is ProMed, which brings together medicos to report on emerging outbreaks. ProMed was reporting on COVID in November, December 2019, and spreading that information through the medical community. And yet ProMed's budget is about $1 million, approximately what a government would spend on one suburban park. So just as we could probably afford 2 McDonald's worth of biological weapons convention, I think we could afford 2 suburban parks worth of ProMed.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we could find lots of examples of money that's less well spent in quite a lot of places. Not necessarily those parks. I'm sure they're lovely. One thing which I was interestingly not in the book, and I don't know if it's deliberate or not, was about risks of sort of biodiversity loss. So there's been a lot of concern that climate change is problematic in itself, but at some point there's the risk that we start losing really important cereal crops, that we start losing pollinators, that we start having massive food catastrophes. Is that something you left out or didn't focus on just because you wanted a book that was infinitely long rather than went on too much, or because you're not as concerned about things like that as other issues?
Yes, I mean, I see that as much more in the realm of bad rather than catastrophic, an outcome which probably would be worked around rather than substantially derailing the human project. Much the same as the loss of bees, for example, and the use of artificial pollinators. I'm really troubled by the fact that a lot of crops now require some man or woman to drive around at night with a whole lot of beehives in order to pollinate the crops every year. But we as a species have sorted that technology out so that the loss of bees hasn't had a tangible impact on humanity.
And you're interestingly focused on the effect that politics has on many of these issues, which is not true of everybody who writes in this area. I haven't seen the concerns about populism expressed as clearly in this context as you do. But equally, you seem to be quite optimistic. I think it's the last or penultimate chapter talks about how fixing politics, make it a mass participation sport, could really start to help with these. Are you just interested in those things as a politician, or do you think that politics really is the driver of so many other of these factors?
Yeah, so many of these issues, Julian, require big institutions to work together. So if we take artificial intelligence risk, if you've got a race between competing AI teams, then there's a danger that safety goes completely out the window. And we forget that with artificial intelligence, we probably need to build the guardrails before we build the highway. So yes, I would love to see politics work better, because as a practicing politician, I think the world is a warmer place when we have people engaged in politics. I'm very influenced by the Tufts political scientist Ethan Hirsch and his book Politics is for Power, that argues very persuasively that too much political activity in advanced democracies in recent years has come to resemble sports fans cheering and jeering on the sidelines, rather than going out onto the field and seeing yourself as a participant, going to local council meetings, getting involved in your local community, discussing political issues with people who think differently from you. More of that style of politics would be valuable in itself, but I also think it's the best response to populism. I'd also urge on those who think that right-wing populism can be beaten by left-wing populism, that actually history teaches us that approach is not particularly well-founded, and that turning up the temperature does tend to help the xenophobes more than it does those who were championing a more inclusive style of politics. So I speak instead in the book about a more stoic approach to politics, one which prizes virtues such as wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, a politics which is more that of Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela than the angry tub-thumping approach that you see from populists of left and right.
Yeah, I mean, I just to add to that, I agree quite thoroughly for what it's worth, but I think there's also an issue about how you define success. And it always frustrates me when increasingly people seem to define political success as the other side losing, which seems to me to be somewhat missing the point. You know, success should be defined by things being better, rather than the other side not getting what they wanted. I don't know what you think about that.
Absolutely. Or in the case of what's the worst that could happen, the human project continuing rather than ending.
Indeed. We're getting a good number of questions coming in. There are some brilliant ones. I should say we'd love to get more questions. We're not going to get through every single one of these. I can already see there are many, many brilliant questions. And I'd just like to have two more with you from me before we bring those in. The first is, so I've had the experience of being an academic, a scientist in politics. You're one of, I don't know how many other academics there are in Australian politics. Does it work? Can you fuse academia with politics successfully?
I think you can. Certainly there's lessons to be learned. If you're an academic economist, as I was, then the best favour that you can do to your colleagues is to go along to one of their seminars, point out the fatal flaw in their paper and show them how to fix it. It turns out that doing so in a party room meeting is not always as appreciated by one's colleagues. More broadly, being aware of the importance of teamwork is something that I'd known to some degree, but really experiencing it is quite different. So recognising that in politics, very little gets achieved through the sheer force of one person's ideas, and that teamwork's absolutely vital. So, you know, I've made that transition now, I think with some reasonable degree of comfort, and there's a handful of us who are in politics from academia. There's probably, you know, some ideal level of academic involvement in politics, which you know, bears in mind William Buckley's maxim that he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the entire faculty of Harvard University. We want some academics in politics, and I always want to act as a conduit to those who are looking to elected office or just want to get their ideas into the political process. But I'm under no illusions that the place would work better if it was just academics running the show.
I think we can be safely sure that would be an interesting experience, but not necessarily a great one. Last question from me. You talk about lots of different risks. Which one scares you the most?
Unaligned artificial intelligence, Julian. There's a lovely little example from an artificial intelligence that is asked to play a game called Coast Runners. Now, Coast Runners is normally completed by the player going around and around the course. But this artificial intelligence discovered that actually you could maximize your score by turning in very small circles and repeatedly blowing up. That just turned out to be a flaw of the game. But if our artificial intelligence is encoded to look for the optimal path, then we might discover that that optimal path isn't the one we want. We're not sure when a superintelligence will exceed our own. The median estimate from one recent survey was 2061, but there's a reasonable margin of error around that. Nonetheless, we know if we put the best chess or Go computers up against the best humans, they beat us at least 99% of the time. So in those realms, the computers look on our intelligence much the same way as we would look on the intelligence of our pets or even bird life. So they will pass us and accelerate away from us, and we need to get the values right. If we do that, then the productivity and welfare, social welfare benefits of artificial intelligence, of a superintelligence, will be extraordinary, and it will have a massive impact on reducing poverty. But we just need to ensure that its values are aligned with ours, and we can't simply take this simplistic approach of it'll be fine, we'll pull out the plug, because as many have noted, an artificial intelligence that wants to do as much good in the world will see not being turned off as being fundamental to that mission.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating area, and obviously explored in literature as well and fiction. You know, Ian M. Banks' Culture series is perhaps an optimistic end. And there's I don't know if you've ever come across it, there's a computer game version of Universal Paperclips, where you get to play the AI gradually taking over everything else and driving that. But it's interesting to hear that's going on. So let me turn now to some of the questions that we've had. So there's a question here from Ben Martin, who says, so in 15 years ago, under the leadership of Sir David King, another Cambridge academic, the UK government established a national risk register. And actually, when they first published that, 2008, the biggest risk they identified for likelihood and impact was a viral pandemic. Despite that, the government didn't do proper preparations for COVID. So even if you identify the risks correctly, as the UK did at that point, how do you actually make people prepare for them? You know, what is it that will get a government to take this seriously?
Yes, look, Ben, I think it's an excellent point, and I wouldn't pretend that we're ever going to get to a utopia of readiness, but I think we can steadily move the needle along. So, for example, no first use doctrine, nuclear weapons would be enormously valuable. It wouldn't take us to a zero risk of nuclear catastrophe, but it would substantially reduce that probability. Improving the Biological Weapons Convention monitoring system might help too, as indeed would some of the proposals around ensuring that the current ability to order genetic material from print-on-demand services via the internet doesn't extend to people's ability to order nasty bugs. You shouldn't be able to order the 1918 influenza strain and have it delivered to your laboratory, but we need to ensure that the monitoring spans all of the firms that will provide that strain, as well potentially as the desktop machines that'll come along. So there's a lot of little tweaks that can be done, and there's tweaks that can be made to politics too. I'm under no illusions that when I shuffle off this mortal coil, there'll be zero populists in the world, but I do think a stoic approach to politics and an encouragement to people to get involved in their local communities is our surest answer to pushing back against the populist tide, along with thinking about the factors that underlie the rise of populists, such as the loss of good middle-class jobs in advanced economies, and how we ensure that that economic base is maintained.
So essentially you mentioned the economic base because there's a question, I'm just trying to find it exactly now, about what do you think is the risk of a large-scale financial meltdown across the planet? Is that a serious threat to you, partly mediated through the things you've just described?
Yes, I think it is unlikely that we would see a sort of 90% drop, which is the sort of magnitude that I'm envisaging when I'm talking about catastrophic outcomes. The drops that we've seen certainly have involved half the value of the share market, although in general we've seen a bounce back, typically within a couple of years. In the case of the Great Depression, I guess it took the bulk of a decade. But the loss of living standards isn't as big as that. We haven't seen 50% drops in living standards across large numbers of countries outside a war context. So, you know, I'm relatively confident on that based on the past trajectory of economic growth. Some of the institutions, such as central bank independence and a recognition of the way in which fiscal policy can be deployed, have been useful in reducing that catastrophic threat. It's again, I suppose, like your comment before about biodiversity, Julian, I'd put financial meltdown in the category of bad things we should invest in averting, but not in the category of catastrophic risks.
So to change tack slightly, there's an interesting question here from Fraser Batty, who says you've argued that populism leads to authoritarianism, but his question is about technocracy, and isn't that also a route to authoritarian government? There's the anti-expert drive, but you could also have a very expert-driven authoritarian government under the guise of dealing with catastrophic risks. What's the balance between not listening to experts and over-listening to experts?
Yes, I mean, look, all of us who have an academic bent need to be careful of the risk of turning into a technocracy. Recognise that whatever clever ideas you have in a democracy need to be explained, and you need to engage with people on these. I don't see the same historical track record of technocracy turning into widespread authoritarianism. I talk in the book, for example, about the way in which Marcos came to power, the rise of Hitler, of course, and various of these other examples in which authoritarians have taken over. I don't look through the historical record and see the same set of experiences in which a group of Cambridge wonks take control of the public service and suddenly drive out democracy. It's not to say that's theoretically impossible. I'm just not sure it's something in practice we've seen a lot.
So Paul Ingram asks about how we communicate with the public. Because there's some quite complex language here. I mean, your book is actually extremely clear, and I hope it is a bestseller, but I don't know what fraction of certainly the British population would ever read it. Are there better analogies, better ways we should all be using to communicate with the public about these issues?
Well, one of the things that we've seen recently is Don't Look Up engaging people on the issue of climate change. What's clever about the movie is that it doesn't mention climate change at all, but everybody gets the allegory for it and understands that the silliness of telling people not to look at an asteroid actually has some resonance in terms of the way in which disinformation campaigns have been run in the case of climate change. So that's certainly one way of engaging. And indeed, the example I gave before about NASA's Planetary Defence Coordination Office coming out of two 1998 movies about asteroid strikes to the US suggests that every now and then Hollywood can move the needle. Dr. Strangelove probably played some part in the movement towards nuclear disarmament, and perhaps the way in which we're going to get in on artificial intelligence will be through people understanding it via movies such as The Matrix and The Terminator. The challenge, though, is that things that get us to the edge of our seats in the movie cinema don't always get us off the couch at home in order to act on making a difference. So it's a matter of having a sensible political conversation, saying, look, what we're asking for here is a very modest investment in order to reduce the probability of a catastrophic risk. And in the context of the pandemic we've just had, a sensible conversation around reducing the probability that zoonotic diseases jump the species barrier, putting more constraints around bioterrorism, and having better detection systems to catch both. That ought to be pretty politically saleable right now.
So, I think it's quite likely there are ways of communicating better. There are also, of course, those who have apparently a vested interest in fomenting some of the problems or getting people to look the other way. So Ray Taylor asks, can we take on the funders and opinion formers of populism on the right, Murdoch and Charles Koch? Do we have a plan that matches that of the big coal oil lobby?
Well, we're certainly seeing a shift in the climate debate over recent years. It's not shifting as fast as I would like it to be, but the movement is pretty substantial. When you've got a large share of the world's economies turning up to Glasgow and putting meaningful climate reductions on the table. I would be much happier if there was more rapid deployment of the key technologies, quicker rollout of electric vehicles, and if we had all countries on board with the sort of decarbonisation we need. But let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're making progress on climate change. We need to accelerate that progress. The question is, can we now turn that to an issue such as nuclear catastrophe, which in my childhood was the big catastrophic risk. Now, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine when we were in 4th grade. We were just about to get on the train and going home from school, and I remember us both saying to one another that we didn't expect we'd finish high school before nuclear war struck the world. And that nuclear Armageddon prospect loomed so large for a kid in Australia in the 1980s, and that meant that it was pretty salient for us. I marched in peace rallies when I was a student because that was a risk I was concerned about. So there's a range of ways into the conversation, using what's happening now to broaden it out and to one by one cut down the dangers of these catastrophic risks, and in so doing, emphasise to people the value of global cooperation, the quality of experts, the strength of having institutions that can put in place long-term solutions.
Now, one aspect of communication is about schools. And so there's an interesting question here about, is there any skill or subject area most missing from school curricula that would prepare future generations for these risks, the most likely crises? What do you think the easy wins are in education?
Look, there may be people on the line who teach trigonometry, and for that I apologise. But I think we should replace a lot of the trigonometry we do with probability and statistics. As somebody who's done a PhD, used very little of my trigonometry. I'm sure there's disciplines in which I would have used it, but in my everyday life, not to say my political work and work as a lawyer before that, used probability constantly. And yet a basic understanding of probability and statistics is quite badly taught in schools, despite the fact that it really matters. It matters in terms of encouraging people to not constantly day trade on the share market and fritter away their earnings. It matters in terms of having people think why it's worth insuring your house, but probably not worth insuring your mobile phone. And it certainly matters when it comes to understanding catastrophic risk. So lots more probability in the curriculum would be my simple answer to that, Julian.
I know some people, I think some listening into this who would agree very firmly, though there's at least some mathematicians who may not. Cambridge has a centre for the public understanding of risk, and there's a lot there about how do you actually communicate. So they will certainly be delighted to hear about this attitude and approach. There's a question I'd just like to turn to about whose responsibility some of this is. So Abdullahi Alim says, Africa will host a third of the world's population by 2100, but its power to inflict catastrophic risks about climate change, misuse of technology, collapse of international collaboration is not really the continent's doing very much. So what can the African continent realistically do to try to avert such crises with its limited global power?
Oh, what a great question, Abdul. Yes, you've gone to an issue that is significantly undercooked in my book, but one that I think is really fundamental. So one of the things that Africa has is a plethora of members of international organisations and an ability to encourage those international organisations to step it up when it comes to tackling international challenges. That's largely evident in climate change and the work that Pacific nations have been doing, again, taking advantage of the number of countries in the Pacific on climate change has been, I think, a useful direction as to where we could go. Africa's going to be heavily impacted by any form of pandemic, whether naturally occurring or made by humans, because of the state of health systems, the large crowded cities, and lower levels of development. So Africa has a natural interest and a natural role in pandemic prevention, and also potentially in detection systems. There's good work being done on how we might improve detection systems in major cities and transport hubs. So having better detection systems for bad bugs in Nairobi could potentially have a big impact throughout the planet. And on artificial intelligence, there have been moves to get more comprehensive international panel in place. There was a move between a push from Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron in 2018 to set up an international panel modelled on the International Panel on Climate Change that would look at artificial intelligence risk. The United States weren't willing to come on board with that, and so the initiative has been watered down to a sort of OECD working group, and I think that's an idea that should be brought back, and it's a natural one for countries in Africa to champion, because the social welfare benefits of getting artificial intelligence right are massive, but the human costs of getting it wrong are huge, and international organisations have not been as focused on it as have universities, which have taken a lot of the lead in terms of getting researchers to sign up to common principles around reducing the risk of an unaligned artificial intelligence.
So there clearly is a story there for Africa. It doesn't have to be sort of the victim of the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
There's a question that's come in about something which we touched on earlier on, but haven't spoken much about, which is bioterrorism. So the question is, how realistically can we mitigate bioterrorism? You know, the technology is not particularly expensive and it's very hard to keep track of. And I might just throw in as well, you know, there's similar issues with chemical weaponry. You know, we remember Sarin and the Aum cult. You know, many of these things are always going to be quite easy to do. What could we possibly do to react?
Yes, it's a really important question, Julian. And I had a conversation on the book with Brian Schmidt, who's the Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University and a former Nobel laureate in physics. And he was arguing that he thought bioterrorism was the biggest danger, simply because CRISPR-Cas9 has emerged so recently. The technology is accelerating so quickly, and regulation doesn't seem to be keeping up. Past groups have tried and failed to get hold of bioweapons. So the poisoning that took place in 1984 in Oregon, the United States, the America's worst bioterrorism incident, ultimately involved putting salmonella into salad bars, or just having tried and failed a strategy of getting hold of HIV to spread HIV through the population. Shrinko, as you say, used sarin gas, having tried and failed to get hold of past diseases, which they hope to spread through the community. The risk now is that the technology has moved in a way that makes it easier for terrorists to use, and you know, we need those checks in place. This is one of those issues, Julian, where our beloved principle of publish or perish does come up against the risk that research can be misused. So-called gain-of-function research, which is looking at how you might make the properties of a virus or a bacteria worse, is scientifically interesting for the curious, but also potentially has what they call dual use. In other words, it could fall into the hands of bad guys. And so better protocols around the publication of those sorts of findings are important. There was a bit of a controversy a couple of years back when some scientists showed that horsepox, which is a cousin disease of smallpox, could be assembled in about 6 months for about $100,000. When the paper was sent to the journal Science, the editors rejected it, not on the basis that it wasn't scientifically interesting, but on the basis that the scientific merit didn't justify having the information out there falling into the wrong hands. But all the authors did was to send it to another journal that then published it, and it was out there anyway. Better codes of conduct between academics and also between journal editors would be quite useful there, just in ensuring that some of that research doesn't go too far.
Although I have to say, I find it hard to know in some cases how you can judge what's too far. You've mentioned CRISPR-Cas9, which is essentially a platform to allow almost any genetic change to be done. Once you open something like that up, it becomes very hard to control what's done with it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I'm not pretending that we could jump tomorrow to a convention that would work out all of the rules around this, but advanced countries are very concerned about researchers collaborating with China and have put in place a whole lot of constraints on the ways in which researchers engage with China. That's happened in Australia, Britain, the United States. and lines have had to be drawn in that debate. I think on a similar principle, you might well want to put a little bit more energy into figuring out exactly what sort of bioresearch is valuable and what sort of bioresearch ought to not be published for fear that it falls into the wrong hands.
There's an interesting question. I mean, you mentioned China as an interesting example. Now, China presumably also has an interest in the human race surviving and not suffering a sort of catastrophic loss. There's no winner if there's not much of a planet left. Do you think the concern is nation state actors, and one could pick China, Russia, Iran, whichever country you want to pick, or non-nation state actors that you'd be concerned about, or frankly human error?
In the case of bioweapons, I think there's probably only a few states that have serious bioweapons programs. Largely there, I'm concerned about non-state actors. In the case of nuclear weapons, I'm more concerned about state actors who may not intentionally, but could inadvertently cause a nuclear war. And in the case of artificial intelligence, I think it is probably state-funded teams that are going to make the most rapid progress. And here the risk is that we get into an artificial intelligence arms race in which the goal is to see who can be the first to build a super intelligent machine that outperforms humans. If you're in a race, then the risk is that the safety standards go out the window and you don't have the sort of careful checks that would ensure that what is being produced is a machine which has the interests of humanity at its core. And then, of course, you can think about different ways in which these interact, in which superintelligence could be used to build bioweapons or indeed to destabilize the current mutually assured destruction compact, which underlies the holding of nuclear weapons.
So one area we haven't really picked up on is about digital technologies other than AI itself. So there's a question from Garth Wilkinson about social media and how that facilitates conspiracy theories getting out of control. Is this an aspect of populism, and is it a major problem that we face, or just a more minor detail that we're focused on at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Garth. I think that's a really interesting comment, which reminds me of a comment that the artificial intelligence researcher Toby Ord makes, that he's much more worried about stupid intelligence than super intelligence. He's more worried about algorithms that embed discrimination, social media algorithms which cause excess conflict within society, and addictive apps which suck the time of teenagers and worsen mental health. He sees that as a much more pressing concern. I'm worried about those things too, but I don't think it's mutually exclusive to be concerned about that, and also about unaligned artificial superintelligence. But in the realm of populism, I suppose that's where the rubber meets the road. Populists have been very good at using social media for disinformation. Certainly, we've seen in Australia our populist politicians grabbing a massively disproportionate share of Facebook time, in part because of that old line, I think apocryphally attributed to Goebbels, that a lie can get twice around the world before the truth can get its boots on. The risk is that on a social media platform, an exciting conspiracy theory can move very, very quickly. What do we do about that? Well, I think we need to be evidence-based in how we respond. Just using your gut to say, oh, this is how I reckon we ought to tackle disinformation can turn out to be destructive. We now know that repeating conspiracy theories followed by a debunking can have the unexpected effect of lodging the conspiracy theory in someone's mind. So now they're talking about strategies such as inoculation, telling people in advance, here's the kind of misinformation you might expect to hear, and here's why you shouldn't trust information coming from those sorts of actors. Or alternatively, the fact sandwich, which seems to work in an evidence-based context. Here's the facts, here's the conspiracy theory, here's the facts again. And that seems to not have the same kind of risk of a backlash. But yeah, I'm combating that in Australia when the conversation around how we improve COVID vaccination rates in Indigenous Aboriginal communities. We've seen disinformation take hold very strongly in those communities and latching on to things that we didn't anticipate at the outset. Indigenous people, for example, were prioritised as a rollout group for the COVID vaccine early on because of higher rates of underlying health conditions. But that then allowed the conspiracy theorists to say on social media, the reason they're having you go first is because this is an experimental drug and they want to test it on Indigenous Australians. Had we been sharper as a polity, we could have gotten ahead of that on social media. Given that we haven't, Indigenous vaccination rates are languishing very badly, and COVID's having a disproportionately bad effect there. So yes, very worried about social media and how we manage those rapidly growing platforms.
And sadly, with that one, the facts are that over the previous decades, some drugs have been tried on minority groups or people in other countries. And so sadly, not in this case, but in other cases, there is a real concern there. Just sticking with the digital thread, there's also a question that's come in about the metaverse, whatever that may be. Is that another risk, or is that something that could be a useful way to alleviate risks? What do you have a perspective on it yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a range of immersive video games that are showing us the initial way in which the metaverse might operate. And it strikes me that its initial use is likely to be among gamers. My concern there isn't a catastrophic one. It's simply that it seems like there is some optimal balance of living in the world and living in devices, and this might tip people a little bit too far in the wrong direction. There's some research coming out of the University of Chicago too on the extent to which low-skilled men in the US have disproportionately dropped out of the labour force over the last decade, and suggesting that a lot of that additional time has gone into gaming. And those games might, if you think in a utilitarian standpoint, the effect of that gaming has been to improve people's utility in the short term. The games are really fun, and the metaverse will probably be even more fun. But they've prevented people from investing in a critical stage of their lives. So they're not investing in education, they're not investing in capital in order to buy a home, and in many cases they're not investing in relationships. So the risk is that short-term happiness that games bring, and immersive games will bring even more, could translate into a long-term cost, and over a lifetime you might see better quality games decreasing well-being. So having that conversation is going to be pretty important, because the game designers are going to want to design games which are as addictive as possible, and full immersion is going to be really, really addictive. So how do we ensure that, like other addictive technologies, smoking, drinking, gambling, we've got the appropriate checks around the metaverse to make sure that users enjoy responsibly, as they say on the packet.
I can just imagine when you get into the VR, it just has a little tag along the bottom that says something like that. But I think, if I remember correctly, China has recently taken some action to ban excessive playing of video games. I mean, it's an interesting, rather different moral approach, I suspect, than would succeed elsewhere. And it brings me to
massive, isn't it? It's something like no gaming during the week and only an hour on weekends. Yeah. So I remember looking at it and thinking, oh, my kids would revolt if I gave them those things.
So that's not going to be in the party platform for the elections coming up.
Absolutely not.
But it slightly relates to Bainan's question, which I want to tie in also to your comments about AI and how do we make sure it shares our values. Does the whole world share our Western moral values? Because if we don't have a shared set of values, how do we say that AI should share human values? Yeah,
no, that's a brilliant question. And you think about the project which was conducted at Dartmouth College in the 1950s, where they arrogantly said that they thought that they could make significant progress in artificial intelligence with 6 very bright men working over the summer. They, of course, failed. But just imagine if they'd succeeded, right? They would have encoded values that were more sexist, racist, and homophobic than those that we believe in today. So there's no reason to think that humanity has sort of achieved the apotheosis of enlightenment, nor indeed that if we encoded values of humanity, that the values of a Middle Eastern sheikh and those of a tertiary educated Scandinavian would be the same. So having machines which are constantly learning our values, I think, has got to be the answer here. And that's where you'd go back to those 3 principles that you want machines to be observant, humble, and altruistic, rather than putting in place a moral code and locking it in for all time, and potentially having civilizations in a couple of centuries look back and say, you locked in those old-fashioned values? What were you thinking?
We're beginning to near the end, so I know it's a bit. Can we go on for a bit longer?
Sure.
So just because there's various questions I would quite like to fit in. So one from Anne Miller is coming back to climate change. And she's saying, isn't climate change on the current trajectory more likely to be catastrophic than AI, but harder to tackle? We know that climate change, there's going to be some heating. We know that's going to happen. AI may succeed. It may cause problems. How do we think about the different approaches, and what should we be doing about climate?
So, Anne, this is almost like the reverse of asking me which of my children I love the most. This is asking me which of my catastrophic risks I worry about the most. And, naturally, as with my children, I'd say all of the above. But if you push me hard on this, the central estimates for warming that we won't get the kind of 6 to 10 degree outcomes, which I believe would need to take place in order to lead to really catastrophic results, where humanity wasn't able to adapt in time, where you got the kind of massive sea level rises, huge movements in crop failure, shooting incredibly destabilizing temperature increases that made outdoor work impossible. So I don't think that's the kind of central estimate of the climate models, though, as Harvard's Marty Weinstein pointed out to us, it's there in the tails, and that's why we should worry about it. With artificial intelligence, though, the expectation among artificial intelligence researchers is we will get there. Now, yes, you can go back to the old joke that super intelligence is a generation away and always will be. But the progress that's being made now seems to suggest that the artificial intelligence winters that the field has seen in the past are less likely in the future, and that whether it is whole brain emulation or some other technological advance, that steadily the artificial intelligence researchers will build up systems which are able to outperform the meat computers we have sitting on top of our necks. And at that point, the question is whether the values are aligned. So that's why I put artificial intelligence risk up there. But yes, let's reduce them both. Why not?
Now, we talked about communication a bit, and Amy Phillips just asks, what are the most user-friendly for the average citizen sources of information online and off, other than your book? What is the sort of, hey mum, hey friend, hey nephew, look at this? What should we all be sharing?
Well, Amy, naturally, you should go first to the website of the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. It's got a lot of engaging material there, and smart thinkers and good podcasts. I quite like 80,000 Hours, which is a good podcast that interviews a range of people working on catastrophic risk, and talks about how young people starting off in their career might be able to have an impact, whether that is scientists wanting to go into fields where they reduce risks, journalists wanting to make a difference in the conversation around risk, policymakers seeking to have an impact through work in the public service, or academics looking to do research. So there's good resources on a plethora of these websites. And I hope that increasingly this conversation is going to grow and become one where we don't just throw up our hands in despair, because I think that's the real danger out of this. But we say, gee, this is an amazing human project we've had going for this last couple of 100,000 years. The time until the sun engulfs the Earth is probably 1 billion years away. And so that means that if humanity had if the lifespan of humanity was compressed to 80 years, we'd just be a few days old right now. And so imagine what our species can do. Imagine the levels of beauty of the art that we could create. Imagine the lives of health, fulfillment, and meaning that the trillions of humans still to come could enjoy. That's why we need to deal with catastrophic risk, because the human project done right is a bloody exciting thing.
That leads me nicely to a question from Laura Kitcher, which I want to paraphrase slightly. So there's one approach to try to save the world, with technologies, population curbs, whatever it might be, to tackle some of these. And the other is the approach that seems to be becoming a bit more popular with some of the tech billionaires, which just say, you know what, we need to get life off to other parts of the universe just in case we mess it up here. Do you think we can save ourselves here, or do we have to take that approach of spreading life before we mess this bit up?
Yeah, so Laura, I think before we think that a mission to Mars is the only solution, we might want to look at some of those cost-effective approaches, like doubling the budget of the Biological Weapons Convention so it covers 2 McDonald's, or improving the access to resources that ProMed has. I think there's a lot of just sensible tweaks that can take place here. So yes, I'm critical in the book of Elon Musk for saying that going to Mars is the solution to this. There is much more economical ways of tackling the problem on the home front. Not to say anything of the physical nature of the human project. Yes, at some point we need to get off the Earth. When the sun engulfs the Earth in 1 billion years' time, I'm sure our ancestors will want to be an interplanetary species. But the risk, if you believe Toby Ord's estimate, is 1 in 6 of a catastrophic event wiping out humanity in the next century. And if you're trying to get that 1 in 6 risk over the next century down to something closer to 0, then the answers are going to lie on Earth, not on Mars.
And that takes me very nicely to the final question I wanted to ask you. I mean, there's a lot of questions we haven't had time for, and there's so many more things we could have looked into. But I want to put to you the question that Martin Rees looks at. So Martin Rees is one of the founders of the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, astronomer royal, fascinating character in many ways. And in his wonderful book, Our Final Century, he reckons that our odds of surviving the next the 21st century are about 50-50. More specifically, the idea that civilization comes to an end in the 21st century at 50-50. What do you reckon the odds are? Are you an optimist?
Yes, I'm more optimistic than Martin. I think there are a range of dangers out there, but odds on, I think it's more like we're playing Russian roulette than living and dying at the toss of a coin. That said, if you believe Martin, then step up and do even more to tackle these challenges. They are issues which ought to be confronting humanity over the long term, and the challenge for all of us who believe in an exciting long-term future is to make it more likely to happen. In some sense, anyone at Cambridge does believe in the long term, because only those who believe in the long term are willing to take the time to invest in education. Education is the ultimate kind of long-term investment in your own career. But we ought to be valuing those generations to come. Even those generations will never meet. So all of us who have kids care deeply about our kids, and people care equally too about their grandchildren. But why shouldn't that principle extend to great-grandchildren who you'll never meet? And for that matter, why shouldn't it extend to your neighbours, great-grandchildren? They'll be pretty amazing people. And I don't believe we should discount the future and discount the well-being of their lives. I think the well-being of their lives ought to be at least the value of our own. And indeed, to discount is to produce sort of absurd results. In 500 years' time, you would effectively say that the population of the planet has no more moral value than that of one person alive today. I don't believe that. I don't believe we should be discounting the future. And therefore, I think that whether you take Toby Ord's 1 in 6 or Martin Rees's 1 in 2, existential risk deserves more attention than it's getting right now.
So I think that's a great place to leave things. We could talk about Roman Krznarics, the good ancestor. He came to another event for us, but that's been really fascinating. Now, unfortunately, it will be hard for us to know whether we have survived the century. I don't know if you're free at the end of the century for a retrospective to see if we made it there, but I hope there will be people around at Jesus College in Canberra to try to think back at that point as to whether we did manage to make it through. But Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, for sharing so many ideas. It's been clear from the interest in the questions and elsewhere just how much people have found this thought-provoking and enjoyed it. I hope you will make it to Cambridge at some point to talk further in person. I understand you have some elections. We haven't talked about Australian politics. We haven't talked about Novak Djokovic or anything else like that. But good luck with all of that whenever the elections come. And we look forward to some of your thinking really making a difference in government policy in Australia and around the world.
Well, thank you, Julian. Your unique combination of academic smarts and political background made this such an enjoyable conversation for me. So thank you for brokering it, and thanks for all the work you do for the public conversation at Jesus College.
Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of Jesus College and the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, thanks. Good morning to you. Good evening to everybody here in the UK. See you again at something, hopefully. All the best. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.